In 1978, an FBI forensic analyst stood before a Washington, D.C. jury and made a claim that would define the next 28 years of a teenager's life. He testified that a single hair found at a murder scene matched the defendant's hair in every microscopic characteristic. The odds of it belonging to anyone else, the prosecutor told the jury, were 1 in 10 million. The jury believed him. They convicted a 17-year-old boy of murder. 28 years later, scientists tested that hair using DNA technology that did not exist in 1978. It did not belong to the defendant. It did not belong to his alleged accomplice. It belonged to a dog. In the early morning hours of July 26, 1978, a 63-year-old cab driver named John McCormick was shot to death on his own front porch in southeast Washington. His wife heard him pleading for his life through the window, followed by a single gunshot. When she looked outside, she saw a man wearing a stocking over his head running from the scene. It was the second killing of its kind in the same neighborhood that month. 2 weeks earlier, a 52-year-old florist named William Horn had been robbed and shot with what ballistics testing would later confirm was the same .32 caliber weapon. Police recovered the stocking mask a block from McCormick's house. Inside it, investigators found several strands of hair. One was sent to the FBI laboratory for microscopic analysis. 9 days after the murder, a woman told police that two young men, 17-year-old Sante Tribble and 20-year-old Cleveland Wright, had sold her a .32 caliber revolver. It was enough for detectives to bring both of them in. Sante Tribble was watching television in his mother's basement when police surrounded the house. He assumed it was about unpaid traffic tickets. Instead, he was taken to headquarters and questioned about a double murder. He had an alibi. Multiple family members placed him at his mother's apartment in Maryland at the time of the shooting. The gun used to sell the witness's testimony, investigators later confirmed, could not even have fired the bullets recovered from either victim. None of it mattered once the hair entered the courtroom. At trial, an FBI analyst testified that he had microscopically compared the hair recovered from the stocking with a sample taken from Tribble's head. He told the jury the hairs were indistinguishable in every characteristic he examined. In closing arguments, the federal prosecutor went further, telling the jury there was, in his words, 1 chance in 10 million that the hair belonged to anyone else. The defense's alibi witnesses, the ballistics inconsistencies, the financial transaction timeline that didn't add up, none of it could compete with a number like that. On January 20th, 1980, the jury convicted Sante Tribble of the murder and armed robbery of John McCormick. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He was 19 years old. His friend Cleveland Wright was convicted separately of the Horn murder and received the same sentence. He spent years writing letters to journalists, attorneys, and innocence organizations, insisting on his innocence. He was denied parole twice because he refused to admit guilt to a crime he said he did not commit. Tribble served 25 years before being paroled in 2003. He spent the next 6 years rebuilding a life under the weight of a conviction he maintained, from the very first day, was wrong. In December 2009, Tribble was reading the Washington Post when an article stopped him cold. A man named Donald Gates, convicted of a different D.C. murder using the same kind of FBI hair analysis, had just been exonerated through DNA testing. Tribble said later that he shouted out loud, "This is me." He contacted the attorney who had represented Gates, a public defender named Sandra Levick. She agreed to request DNA testing on the hair evidence that had sent him to prison nearly 3 decades earlier. It took over a year. In January 2012, a laboratory in Pennsylvania returned the results. None of the 13 hairs recovered from the stocking matched Tribble's genetic profile. None of them matched Cleveland Wright either. The hair the FBI had sworn under oath was a near-certain match. The hair that put 2 teenagers in prison for most of their adult lives was not even close. And one of the 13 hairs recovered from that stocking, the analysis revealed, was not human at all. It came from a dog. 2 FBI-trained forensic examiners had looked through a microscope at evidence that would determine the outcome of a murder trial and could not distinguish a human hair from a canine one. In May 2012, a D.C. Superior Court judge threw out Tribble's conviction. Cleveland Wright, who had already been paroled in 2007 after serving longer than Tribble for refusing to admit guilt, was exonerated as well. What happened next extended far beyond two men's lives. Tribble's attorney discovered that the same FBI examiner who testified in his case had given similarly exaggerated statistical claims in at least three other prosecutions. That discovery triggered a federal review of every case in FBI history involving microscopic hair comparison testimony, over 3,000 cases spanning more than 2 decades. The results of that review were almost impossible to comprehend. The Department of Justice found that FBI examiners had overstated forensic matches in at least 90% of the first 268 cases reviewed. 26 of the 28 examiners whose work was checked had given testimony or written reports containing errors that wrongly implicated defendants. According to later reporting, 35 of those defendants had received the death penalty. 9 of them had already been executed. Santai Tribble spent 28 years in prison. He had only 8 years of freedom before he reconnected with the legal system to clear his name, and only 8 more years after that. He died in 2020 at the age of 59 from a long illness his family attributed to the decades he spent incarcerated. He spent more of his life paying for a hair that was never his than he spent free. What this case leaves behind is not really a question about one analyst or one stocking mask or even one wrongful conviction. It is a question about how much weight a courtroom places on the appearance of scientific certainty, a number like 1 in 10 million delivered with total confidence by a man in a government laboratory coat. The science was never as certain as the testimony made it sound. Nobody in that courtroom knew it. The jury didn't know it. The judge didn't know it. Even some of the FBI's own examiners may not have fully understood the limits of what their microscopes could actually prove. A teenager lost 28 years of his life to a single strand of hair that a government laboratory was certain belonged to him. It belonged to a dog. If this case made you stop and think, that's exactly why we made it. Hit like if you want more stories like this. And subscribe to Veil of Truth, because the cases that matter most are the ones nobody talks about.